Welcome to the Drowsy Historian, where time slows down and the past whispers you to sleep. Tonight we drift into the shadowy world of herbal brews, whispered prayers, and worn hands that healed bodies and broke taboos. Through flickering candles and damp forest paths, we follow the untold life of a medieval healer, someone caught between miracles and madness. Chapter 1: The Village's Quiet Watcher. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the village stirred, not with bustling carts or clanging anvils. Those came later. This hour belonged to someone else. A figure cloaked in brown wool, hair tucked under a linen coif, moved quietly past sleeping cottages. A pouch of dried leaves jostled at her hip. The healer was awake. In nearly every medieval village, someone like her existed. Part herbalist, part midwife, part confessor, and part scapegoat. The church may have had its abbots, the manor its reeve, but no one knew the villagers' bodies like the healer. She had no title, no formal education, and no rights in court, but to the people whose babies she delivered and whose fevers she soothed she mattered. Quietly, dangerously she mattered. She didn't own land. Most healers didn't. They lived at the edge, sometimes literally, in cottages pushed to the margins of the village. Their gardens were overgrown, but not from neglect. Elder, comfrey, and mugwort weren't weeds in her eyes. They were tools, comfrey for broken bones, elderflowers for fevers, mugwort for dreams. These weren't guesses, they were lifelines. The knowledge had come to her not from books but from hands, her mother's and hers before that. She remembered how her grandmother taught her to dry foxglove in small bundles, warning that too much could stop a heart cold. She learned to press plantain into open wounds, and to mash garlic to draw out infection. These things weren't called science, not yet, but they worked. And still, when someone died, eyes would turn to her. They always did. It was a dangerous sort of knowing, too much to be safe, too little to be protected. She wasn't allowed to read Latin medical texts or apprentice in a university. Those were privileges of male physicians trained in towns and cities, draped in gowns and quoting Galen. But those physicians didn't live here. They didn't walk through manure and frost to cradle a laboring woman's head, or spend nights steeping onion and ale for an infected bite. She did. She always did. Medieval medicine was less about healing and more about balancing. The body, they believed, was governed by four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness came when these humours fell out of balance. Too much blood made one feverish, too much phlegm left you sluggish. A healer knew how to tilt the scales, sometimes through herbs, sometimes through bleeding, and sometimes through terrifying rituals that made you question whether this was medicine or magic. Leeches were used not just because they were believed to suck out the bad, but because they were available, cheap, easy to catch. Held in small pots, they became grim tools of necessity. She didn't enjoy using them. No healer did. But when a man's forehead burned and his lips cracked from heat, what else could be done? Of course, for every life saved, there were two rumors whispered. If a boy recovered from fever, the healer was praised. If he died, it was because she hadn't prayed hard enough, or worse, because she had cursed him. Many feared her, and fear is its own disease. Some of this fear was fueled by the healer's solitude. She rarely married. Her time was claimed by others' emergencies. Her home smelled of vinegar, lavender, and things that didn't belong in polite company. She dried animal bladders, collected snail slime, boiled urine for diagnosis. To the villagers, she wasn't quite part of them, not quite outside either, something in between. And yet they came, every time. A mother with a colicky infant would knock on her door by moonlight, eyes red from crying. A farmhand gored by a bull would be carried in on a litter, trailing blood and prayers. They never said thank you, but they Interesting fact, in many regions of medieval Europe, particularly between the 12th and 15th centuries, female healers outnumbered licensed male physicians in rural areas. Male doctors clustered in cities where they could charge higher fees and consult for noble houses. Villagers relied on what was available, usually older women with hard hands and sharper instincts. Sometimes they were paid in coin, more often in chickens, bread, or favors. Their treatments weren't always gentle. A healer might cauterize a wound with hot iron, or pack it with moss and honey. She might mix lard and ashes into a salve, or grind dried animal organs into powders, not out of cruelty but desperation. There were no antibiotics, no sterilization. A healer knew that every decision balanced on the edge of loss, Despite her lack of formal standing, she kept a kind of order. She tracked the fevers that moved through the village, noted when childbirths became more dangerous. She paid attention to the seasons, because certain herbs only grew after frost, and others wilted in sun, and she learned, always from the dead, because no healer forgets the ones they couldn't save. The healer in our village, we might call her Ilsa, once tried to stitch a shepherd's leg after it was gashed by a rusted plough blade. She soaked the wound in wine, stitched it tight, packed it with thyme and she stayed with him 3 nights, but the wound festered. By the 4th night his skin blackened, he died clutching her wrist, and in the morning his wife spat at her doorstep. That night, someone threw a stone through her window, and yet, 2 weeks later the same wife returned, begging her to help with her daughter's cough. This was how it was. It was a life of contradictions, revered in private, reviled in public, trusted with children, yet blamed for sickness, living with knowledge that brought both respect and risk. And so each morning before the sun, the healer walked the woods alone, not just to collect but to breathe. Out there under dew-covered ferns and rustling branches, she wasn't a threat, she wasn't a witch or a savior, just a woman listening to leaves, weighing her next remedy in silence. The village would wake soon, fires would be lit, cows would be milked, and by afternoon someone would come knocking again with a swelling, a scream, or a prayer, and she would answer. She always did. There was a pattern to the days, even when chaos knocked at her door. Most medieval healers lived by cycles, not clocks. The rising mist, the ripening of berries, the fall of certain leaves told them more about time than any church bell. Ilsa, like many in her strange in-between role, learned to read the village by its ailment. Spring brought rashes and infected cuts from careless planting. Summer carried fevers and heat stroke. Autumn delivered aching backs and spoiled food. And winter brought death. She had no ledger, no casebook. What she carried was memory, sharpened by experience and fear. She knew whose child was born weak-lunged and would likely not survive the frost. She remembered the old man with the purple vein pulsing at his temple, dead within a week from what we might now call a stroke, but what villagers then blamed on bad wind, or a punishment from God. She had seen too many bodies twist before her, knowing full well there was nothing left in her basket to help, and still she stayed. Knowledge was her armor, but it was a brittle thing. Take the concept of diagnosis for example. In a medieval village, people didn't think in terms of bacteria or viruses. Illness was spiritual, elemental. It came from imbalance of humors, of sin, of nature itself. A healer then had to read not only the body but the soul. Was the patient melancholic, choleric, sanguine? Did they suffer from too much cold or too much dryness? A simple fever could have 6 different causes, and half of them had no cure. To navigate this, healers like Ilsa used tools that were half medical, half symbolic. Urine was one of the most common. She could read a person's health by the color, smell and even taste of their urine. Sweetness might signal death, cloudiness might mean kidney trouble. It wasn't superstition, it was as close to internal diagnostics as medieval medicine could get. Physicians in universities used elaborate urine charts, but the village healer, she trusted her eyes and nose. Her remedies came from nature, and some of them worked truly. Modern science has confirmed that many of their herbs had medicinal properties. Willow bark, for instance, was used for pain and inflammation. It contains salicin, the chemical cousin of aspirin. Garlic, applied to wounds, has antibacterial effects. Honey, used in dressings, fights infection and promotes healing. But for every proven treatment, there were others born of desperation or myth. Powdered toad for epilepsy, burnt sheep dung for nosebleeds, crushed pearls for indigestion. These weren't jokes, they were the edge of knowledge, drawn in chalk on a moving wall. And if a healer strayed too far outside accepted practice, or simply failed at the wrong time, she risked more than her reputation. Inquisitions didn't just happen in cities. Even in small villages, fear could bloom like mold. A failed cure could easily become an accusation. Was that balm she applied, or a curse? Was her chanting to soothe the child or summon a demon? After all, wasn't it odd that she never married, that animals never came near her hut? Women like Ilsa learned early how to walk invisible, not silent, not submissive, but careful. They knew when to call their work God's mercy, and when to invoke saints instead of stars. She kept an icon of Saint Apollonia by her window, not because she believed in it, but because others needed to see it. Apollonia was the patron saint of toothaches, Ilse left it visible as insurance, and still toothaches were the least of her burdens. Consider the deeper wounds, the broken ribs from drunken fights, the twisted limbs from threshing accidents. Medieval healers did not have casts or x-rays. They used wooden splints, tied with linen soaked in vinegar. They prayed the bones would align, and that infection wouldn't take hold. They packed cavities with cloth or wax. Some stitched wounds with horsehair, others used cobwebs, believing them to be both binding and blessed. These weren't myths, they were practical attempts with what little was available. And then there were the wounds no one could see. Epilepsy, hysteria, melancholy. Today we see them as neurological or psychological, but in Ilse's world they blurred with possession, divine punishment, or elemental imbalance. When a young boy collapsed in fits, she crushed valerian root, burned sage, and muttered protective verses she barely believed in. Not because she was sure it would work, but because doing nothing was more dangerous. Dark fact: many medieval healers were subjected to ordeals to prove their innocence when accused of sorcery. One common method was trial by water. If the accused floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, and often drowned. Another was trial by fire, carrying hot iron or placing hands in boiling water, with wounds inspected days later. Healers lived knowing this could be their fate, if public opinion turned. Still, people came to her, not because she was trusted, but because there were no other options. The real physicians cost more than a year's wage, and even they, armed with theories from ancient Greece, often did no better. At least Ilse stayed through the night. She once sat beside a boy for 3 days, sponging his forehead, forcing honey water between clenched teeth. He lived. Another time she had to tell a woman that her infant, born blue and silent, could not be revived. The woman howled like a wounded animal, then fled. That night a dead crow was left on Ilse's doorstep. It wasn't always this bleak. There were moments of peace. An old man who recovered from gout and brought her apples in a woven basket. A child who insisted on kissing her rough hands after her fever broke. A merchant's wife who gave her a bit of lace in thanks. But these were rare. Gratitude was fleeting. Fear lingered long, and still she walked the fields each morning, searching for the right leaves, roots and barks. She whispered their names under her breath. Not spells, memories. Each plant had its story, its warning, its miracle. Because to be a healer wasn't just to it was to carry centuries of hard-earned, barely trusted, deeply needed knowledge. It was to walk through fire with no shoes, to hold the balance between relief and blame, and to endure quietly, endlessly. And that was how the village survived. Not on miracles, not on but on someone like her. Chapter 2, Healing Without a License. She was never meant to be a healer, not officially. There was no scroll bearing her name, no oath before the church, no license from the king. And yet, every cough, cut and convulsion brought someone to her door, because in most medieval villages, healing wasn't something taught in ivory towers. It was handed down quietly, cautiously, from one calloused palm to another. Ilse's apprenticeship began not in a lecture hall, but in a dark kitchen thick with the scent of crushed thyme and boiled goat's milk. Her mother spoke little, preferring her remedies to do the talk. Listen to the cough, she once whispered, pressing a hot onion poultice to a toddler's chest. It tells you where the rot lives. There was no textbook. Her lessons were carved into memory by repetition, urgency and fear. This was the path for most folk healers. No certificate, no Latin, just generations of folk wisdom passed through bloodlines and whispered over bedsides. And though universities in Salerno, Paris and Bologna taught Galenic medicine to men in robes, women like Ilse learned in shadows, barns and candlelit corners. By the 12th century, formal medicine was rising fast. Doctors or physicians were educated men who studied ancient Greek and Roman texts, the teachings of Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna. They debated causes of illness with philosophical vigor, drawing colored charts of humors and prescribing complex regimens, but they rarely touched the sick themselves. That was the job of lesser figures, barber surgeons, midwives, apothecaries and of course folk healers. Healers like Ilse existed outside this framework, yet bore the brunt of responsibility when illness struck. They couldn't recite the aphorisms of Hippocrates, but they knew how to lance a boil, coax a breech baby into turning, or brew the precise tincture to reduce swelling. Their medicine was empirical, learned not from theory but from failure, and that was the danger. To the authorities, both religious and civic, an unlicensed healer was not just an outsider, she was a threat, because knowledge without sanction was power outside control. In some regions, particularly in 13th century France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, women were explicitly banned from practicing any form of medicine. Church decrees declared it unlawful for women to treat male patients. Some cities required healers to register with guilds or local clerics, but few women did. They couldn't afford the bribes, they couldn't read the paperwork, and some simply refused to kneel for permission, so they practiced in secret, or under cover of tradition. A midwife wasn't always seen as a healer, unless the baby died. A herb woman was just a gatherer, until her salve failed to stop a lord's infection, then she was a fraud, or worse, a witch. This grey zone left women like Ilse vulnerable. There was no shield from accusations, no board to appeal to. One angry villager, one failed treatment, one miscarriage, and the murmurs would start. She uses strange roots. She mutters in the woods. Have you noticed how her garden never withers? Ilse kept her tools simple. She didn't own surgical knives or ornate scales. Her tools were everyday items repurposed. A wooden bowl for mixing, a rough stone for grinding, bone needles for stitching. She used wool soaked in brine to dress wounds, and clay pots to store remedies. Her medicines were hand-labeled in symbols only she understood. Not to be secretive, just to be safe, because too much understanding, too much confidence in a woman was its own kind of crime. Let's not romanticize it. Many of these remedies were dangerously ineffective. For fevers, she might use a mix of vinegar, crushed mint and goat urine. For epilepsy, a boiled mouse skull wrapped in linen and placed beneath the tongue. Sound foolish now, but in a world where disease was a mystery, and every sickness might be divine punishment, even absurdity became medicine. Yet mixed among the absurd were gems of truth. They knew willow bark eased pain. They knew certain mushrooms calmed the nervous system. They saw that honey helped wounds heal faster. Their knowledge didn't come from controlled studies. It came from watching, remembering, adjusting, a form of science, raw and desperate. Ilse had learned to trust signs. Yellow skin meant failing liver. Bluish lips meant cold poisoning. Swollen tongues warned of choking. She couldn't name the organs, but she saw what they did when broken, and she remembered. One of her few regular visitors was a tanner's daughter, a girl named Bertha, who suffered from falling fits, what we'd now call seizures. The townsfolk feared her, muttering about devils. Ilse brewed valerian root and hyssop tea, rubbed her temples with lavender oil. It didn't cure her, but it soothed her, let her sleep, let her breathe. That was often the best any healer could do. Soothe, not save. Interesting fact, many folk healers recorded their remedies in leech books, rudimentary personal journals of treatment. Few survive, but those that do reveal a mix of herbal, magical and religious practices. Prayers might be written beside recipes, healing words beside recipes for dragon's blood salves. It was a collision of worlds, nature and the divine, science and superstition. And while physicians discussed diagnosis in Latin behind monastery walls, Ilse was patching up gashes with yarrow poultices and ash. Was it cleaner? No. Was it faster? Yes. And in most villages, speed meant survival. She knew she wasn't welcome in guild halls or lecture rooms, but the village welcomed her in its own crooked way. They came when desperate, not proud, and Ilse learned to accept that. She wasn't chasing titles, she wasn't proving theories, she was keeping people alive, and that was enough. Ilse knew her place in the unspoken hierarchy of medieval medicine. It was low, just above the leper and slightly below the tooth puller, but unlike licensed physicians in distant towns, she didn't wear robes. She wore stains, wormwood on her sleeves, smoke in her hair, and the pungent odor of onion poultice lingering in her skirts. She wasn't in it for prestige, she was in it because if she left, someone would die sooner. Physicians, for all their learning, were rare and expensive. In the countryside, most people would live their entire lives without seeing one. Their books were thick with Latin, their treatments high with theory, but they often refused to treat those who couldn't pay up. They relied on case histories, formal diagnosis, and prescribed diets according to humor theory, but they didn't get their hands dirty. Ilse did. A village healer didn't have the luxury of refusing work. She couldn't say, "This man is beyond my skill," or "This child's illness is too rare." She simply tried. If she failed, the family would talk. If she succeeded, they would forget. No one built statues for the village herb woman, but they remembered her when the coughing didn't stop. She treated the symptoms with what she had: clove water for toothaches, plantain poultice for cuts, rue for aching joints. And when nothing worked, she turned to incantations, not because she believed in them fully,
but because the patient did. Healing was as much ritual as it was physical relief. The rhythm of a chant, the scent of burning herbs, the comfort of the familiar. It calmed the body, even if it did nothing to the sickness. It was performance, yes, but one born of care. One of the strangest contradictions of medieval medicine was how often folk healers were accused of sorcery and then begged to cure a demonic possession in the same breath. Ilse had once been summoned to tend to a young woman named Gretel, said to be possessed after months of violent trembling and unholy speech. The priest declared it a case of satanic affliction. The villagers kept their distance, but Ilse did. She recognized the signs, not of demons, but of a fevered mind. She rubbed crushed marjoram into the girl's palms, cooled her with rosewater, and sang softly until the girl's breathing slowed. Over days she returned again and again, each time bringing less fear and more warmth. When Gretel finally slept for an entire night, the priest called it a miracle. The villagers credited divine intervention. No one thanked the healer. That was the unwritten law of her trade. If she succeeded, it was the grace of God. If she failed, it was her fault alone. Interesting fact, while universities restricted formal training to men, many women gained medical authority through religious roles. Some nuns became skilled healers in convent infirmaries, where they documented treatments in Latin. But outside those stone walls, lay women had only one path: apprenticeship through experience, not endorsement. Yet these women often treated more patients in a lifetime than a physician ever would. Ilse wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in pulse, breath, temperature. She judged health through sweat and color. She pressed her ear to chest to hear rattling lungs. She sniffed infections. She tasted iron on the breath. She looked for signs no academic could teach. And she saw patterns: fevers following harvest, boils after winter rains, convulsions when the village drank too long from stagnant pools. The physician read symptoms as isolated problems. Ilse read them like threads of a tapestry, interwoven, seasonal, sometimes spiritual. It was intuition honed through repetition. She had no instruments. The most advanced tool in her home was a mortar and pestle carved from riverstone. But she had her notes, scraps of parchment, wax tablets, bundles of tied herbs labeled with wax seals and bone carving. Her system was known only to her. She didn't dare teach it openly, because teaching it could cost her life. There was one bitter winter when a merchant's child fell ill, his belly swollen, skin pale, breath short. The village priest declared it punishment for grief. The father called for a doctor from the city, who never came. Then he called Ilse. She used boiled nettle tea, crushed anise, warm compresses. The boy recovered slowly but fully. Word spread. Some villagers started calling her wise woman. Others muttered witch with equal frequency. It was a common pattern. The moment her work outpaced their understanding, it threatened their sense of order. She wasn't meant to succeed, because success without authority unsettled everything. Another healer from a nearby parish had once told her, "They'll kiss your hands today and burn you tomorrow." Ilse never forgot it. In truth, many healers straddled that same dangerous divide between reverence and rejection. They worked in the shadows of the church, but outside its rule, they relied on rituals, saints, nature and sheer grit. They were theologians of the body, not the soul. Sometimes Ilse would take her basket and walk into the hills for hours. There she collected mosses, berries, roots. She studied the bark of birch trees and the way mold grew on rock. Nature was her scroll. The forest whispered things no man in a robe could ever write. She wasn't always right, but she was present. That counted for something. When a baby was born too soon, she stayed up all night feeding it goat's milk by drop. When a woman miscarried, she brewed calming teas and kept silent vigil. When a farmer twisted his ankle on frozen ground, she used cabbage leaves and linen straps to bind it tight. And when she failed, and she did, she mourned quietly, not for herself, but for the knowledge she hadn't yet found, the remedy that didn't come in time. She was not a saint, she was not a scholar, she was not licensed, but she was the only thing standing between sickness and silence, and that was enough. Again and again it had to be.
Chapter 3. The Herb Cabinet of Life and Death. Ilse's herb cabinet wasn't a cabinet at all. It was a cluttered assortment of clay jars, bundled roots, hanging stems and crushed powders stacked along wooden shelves beside the hearth. Some were wrapped in cloth, others sealed with beeswax. Many bore crude symbols carved into the lids, crosses, circles, lines, her own shorthand. To the untrained eye it looked chaotic, but to her it was a world of meaning, danger and hope. Each plant had a story, a season and a soul. Some healed, some soothed, and some, when measured wrong, killed. The medieval healer didn't use the term pharmacology, but in practice she lived by it. Ilse knew that yarrow slowed bleeding, that elderflower broke fevers, that comfrey knit bones beneath the skin. She didn't need the Latin names to understand their power. But what separated a healer from a poisoner was measurement, something nearly impossible without scales or precision tools. So she relied on instinct and touch. She'd rub a dried leaf between her fingers to test its texture. She'd taste a root before grinding it. She'd sniff a flower to judge its potency. This wasn't magic. It was empirical, repetition honed into accuracy by necessity. She often began her day in the woods, a knife strapped to her belt, a basket in hand. She walked familiar paths lined with nettles, burdock and tansy. If a traveler passed her and saw her kneeling in the dirt, whispering as she picked leaves, they might assume she was praying. In truth, she was counting leaves, petals, stems. The number mattered. Too much mugwort and the dreams became nightmares. Too little and nothing happened at all. Interesting fact, mugwort was believed to ward off evil spirits and aid in dream work. Healers like Ilse used it to soothe anxiety and aid sleep, but also to induce menstruation, a dangerous function in an age when regulating a woman's cycle could raise suspicions of witchcraft or abortion. Her workspace smelled earthy, damp bark, bitter oils, a sweetness that masked rot. Some herbs were dried and stored for years. Others had to be used fresh, mashed quickly and boiled. Timing was everything. Garlic, for example, was used raw, crushed and stuffed into wounds to prevent infection. Honey was spread across burns to prevent festering. Poppy seeds were boiled into a thick syrup to calm pain, but too much could lead to sleep that never ended. She measured with her eyes, her hands, her caution, and then there was foxglove. Its purple bells looked almost divine in bloom, but foxglove, what we now know contains digitalis, was deadly. In small doses it steadied the heart. In larger ones, it stopped it cold. Few dared use it. Ilse did, but only when all else failed. These plants weren't benign. They demanded respect, and that's what separated the healer from the hedge witch, the charlatan, and the amateur. Ilse knew that every remedy carried risk, and she bore that weight in every concoction she brewed. One winter she was summoned for a boy burning with fever, his lips blistered, his eyes unfocused. The family had kept him in a smoke-filled room, praying the fire would drive out the illness. When Ilse arrived, she found a child barely breathing. She used elderflower tea, willow bark tincture, and cold cloth steeped in vinegar. He survived. The mother wept in her arms. A week later, that same mother claimed that Ilse's touch had left a mark on her son's chest. Proof, she said, that the devil's hand had intervened. Fear doesn't need facts, only memory. Still, Ilse never stopped. Her remedies were her rebellion. Every dried petal, every crushed seed was a defiance of ignorance and fatalism. Consider this. Medieval healers understood the warming and cooling properties of plants long before modern chemistry named their compounds. They knew that mint cooled the blood, that mustard heated it, that fennel purged the bowels. They might not have called it capsaicin or eugenol, but they understood effects. Theirs was a knowledge built from centuries of trials, some brilliant, some horrific. Not all herbs were gathered, some were traded. Traveling tinkers and Romani vendors brought strange powders from distant lands, turmeric, cinnamon, myrrh. Ilse once bartered for a fragment of dried ginger, which she ground into a warming tea for an old woman who couldn't feel her toes. The woman swore it cured her. More likely it simply stimulated circulation. Either way, the healer became a legend for a week. But not all legends were kind. One man, drunk and bleeding after a tavern brawl, insisted she give him a salve that would make him invincible. When she offered him honeyed vinegar and comfrey root, he scoffed. "What good are weeds to a warrior?" He spat. She said nothing. Days later he returned, infection bubbling through his arm. She treated it. He lived. He never thanked her. Her shelves were full of contradiction. Chamomile for calm, nettle for strength, nightshade for pain and for ending pain, if the pain became unbearable. She never spoke of the doses that crossed that line, but she knew them. There were stories of healers who gave too much, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. If a child suffered too long, if a man could no longer eat or sleep, some healers made choices they never admitted aloud. Not mercy killings, just quiet conclusions.
Ilse had never crossed that line, not yet, but she'd stood near it, more than once. And so each jar, each bundle, each root carried not just the weight of life, but the whisper of death. This was her cabinet, not a place of comfort, not a place of miracles, but a place of balance, of control wrestled from chaos, of hope shaped from roots. And when someone came to her limping, pale, shaking, she never promised healing. She only promised to try, because in the end, that was all a healer could offer, and often, it was enough. In the eyes of most villagers, Ilse's shelf of herbs was closer to a spellbook than a medical kit. They didn't know what each jar contained, only that when their pain screamed louder than their faith, they turned to her mixtures before they turned to God. That fear, that awe, made her powerful, but it also made her vulnerable. For what the peasant could not explain, he could only fear, and what he feared he was quick to condemn. The line between medicine and magic in medieval Europe was almost invisible. People believed in saints and relics, but also in charms and potions. A healer's tincture might be praised as blessed one day, and denounced as witchcraft the next. It all depended on whether the patient lived. Ilse knew the risk of every ingredient she kept. Rue, used to repel fleas and stimulate menstruation, was effective, but toxic in large amounts. Wormwood could reduce swelling and purge the stomach, but too much would cause hallucinations or seizures. Mandrake was infamous. It dulled pain, relaxed the body for surgery, but could also slow the heart to silence. She had only used it twice. Both times she said prayers she didn't believe in. Herbal medicine in the medieval world was a strange hybrid. It pulled from Roman texts, Celtic lore, Christian ritual, and empirical observation. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, wrote extensively about viriditas, the green force of healing found in plants and the divine. Yet on the same shelf, one might find the Lachnunga, an Anglo-Saxon leech book, filled with remedies like boil a worm in beer for gout. It was a blend of wisdom and wild guesses, and it worked just often enough to matter. Ilse didn't have books, but she had patterns. She knew that certain herbs were best harvested under specific moons. That bark peeled before sunrise was stronger. That marigold gathered on Midsummer's Day kept better through winter. Whether those practices had real botanical merit or simply superstition, she honored them, not to impress others but because the cost of being wrong was always someone else's pain. Her favorites were the quiet herbs, the ones that did their work without fanfare. Meadowsweet for headaches, calendula for irritated skin, horehound for stubborn coughs. She rarely used the flashy ones, the ones that could shift a fever in hours or silence pain in seconds. Those were too risky, too unpredictable. They made the village whisper louder. One boy, maybe 8 years old, had come to her convulsing after eating spoiled meat. His skin was grey, his breath stank of rot. Ilse brewed a tea from charcoal and bitter fennel and forced it down his throat spoon by spoon. He vomited so violently she thought he would choke, but he lived. Later the boy's father claimed it was his prayers, not the brew, that had saved him, and then in the same breath, warned her not to play God again. Interesting fact, medieval healers often used ashes, clay or chalk in their remedies, not just symbolically but practically. Activated charcoal, though they didn't know the term, was a known remedy for poisoning, capable of binding to toxins in the gut. They didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the result. Results were everything. Ilse's space was a contradiction, a corner of controlled chaos. Beeswax candles flickered low, casting strange shadows across her labeled jars. Threads of rosemary hung from the rafters, not just for preservation, but to mask the scent of wounds and poultices. Dried toads, owl feathers, and animal bones lined one shelf, not because she believed in their magic, but because patients expected them. It was performance, and sometimes performance healed more than potions. One of the more misunderstood aspects of medieval healing was the use of prayer. Many assume that healers relied solely on herbalism, but in reality, they often blended ritual with remedy. Ilse would murmur blessings as she applied a salve, not from belief, but because the body listens differently when the soul feels reassured. A soothing voice, a rhythmic chant. It slowed the breath, calmed the nerves. The placebo effect had no name then, but it had enormous power. She learned this the hard way when a woman named Agatha brought her a festering wound, wrapped in rotting linen. The infection had already blackened the edges. Ilse cleaned it, burned sage over it, and applied a compress of honey and garlic. But she also took Agatha's hand and prayed with her, quietly, without witnesses. Days later, when the wound began to close and the fever broke, Agatha told the entire village it was the prayer that worked. Ilse let her believe it. What mattered was the healing. She often wondered how much of her work was physical, and how much was emotional. How much came from the plant itself, and how much from the hope she delivered it with. She wasn't deluded. She had seen her teas fail, her pastes rot, her powders sour. Not every remedy was a miracle, but if it offered comfort, then perhaps that was miracle enough. Still, she never let herself grow complacent. She documented every batch, how it smelled, how long it took to brew, how the patient reacted. If a remedy failed, she adjusted. If it worked, she noted it with a mark only she understood. Her memory was her laboratory, her hands, her instruments, her results, written into the bodies of the living. There were rumors, of course, that she could cure madness with a kiss, that she kept a devil in her garden, that she buried hearts beneath her hut. None were true, but she never denied them. Mystery was sometimes her best shield. What many never understood was how lonely her role could be. A healer didn't get to fall ill. She didn't get to cry in public or show weakness. If she bled, she treated herself. If she grieved, she swallowed it with nettle tea. Because the moment she faltered, the village would lose faith, and perhaps more dangerously, suspicion would bloom. And so she endured. Every leaf she plucked, every tincture she bottled, every whisper she spoke. These were acts of resistance. Resistance against ignorance, against helplessness, against the idea that only men in robes with Latin tongues could hold the key to health. Her cabinet was her rebellion. And as long as she had fingers to crush, eyes to read symptoms, and a mouth to speak the names of plants, she would not stop. Because in the quiet war between suffering and survival, she chose to fight with roots, steam and silence. And for those who lived because of her, whether they admitted it or not, that was enough. Chapter 4: Blood, Pus and Leeches. The first time Ilse bled a man, she nearly fainted. Not from the blood itself, she had seen enough of that to be numb, but from the knowledge that she was crossing a line. This was not herbalism, this was the realm of intervention. Flesh was being cut, and it was her hand holding the blade. Bleeding in the medieval world was not a desperate last resort. It was often the first treatment. To understand why, you must understand the theory of humors. Medieval medicine was built around balance. 4 humors within the body, each aligned with elements and personality types: blood, air, sanguine; yellow bile, fire, choleric; black bile, earth, melancholic; and phlegm, water, phlegmatic. Illness was the result of imbalance. A fever, too much blood; lethargy, excess phlegm; mania, a surge of yellow bile. Treatments aimed to restore that equilibrium, often violently. Bloodletting was a favorite among physicians and folk healers alike. It was believed to draw out heat or release bad spirits. It could be done with a knife, a lancet, or more often leeches. Ilse had learned to use all 3. She kept her leeches in a damp clay jar near the hearth. The creatures, black and slick, pulsed faintly when warm. She fed them only when needed. It took practice to apply them correctly. Place them on the wrong spot, and they refused to bite. Leave them too long and the patient grew weak. She remembered a time when a young shepherd came to her with a pounding head and bloodshot eyes. He'd been out in the sun too long, working without water. His pulse throbbed in his temple. The villagers called it fire in the brain. Ilse used leeches behind his ears, and on the inner elbow, a common site for drawing blood. When the leeches dropped off, swollen and sluggish, the boy's headache eased. Whether it was placebo or actual relief, she couldn't say, but he left smiling. Interesting fact, medieval leech therapy was based on more than superstition. The anticoagulant hirudin, found in leech saliva, does thin the blood and has been used in modern medicine for clotting disorders. Of course, medieval healers had no idea why it worked. They only knew it sometimes did. Not all bleeding was so tidy. When leeches failed, or weren't available, Ilse used a lancet, a small flat blade shaped like a bird's beak. She heated it in the fire to sterilize it, though she didn't use that word. She called it cleaning with flame. With practiced hands, she'd slice open a vein in the arm or ankle, letting the blood pour into a shallow bowl lined with rags. Most patients passed out before they begged her to stop. Children were bled less frequently. Pregnant women, rarely unless desperation trumped fear. The weak and elderly, only when death felt certain anyway. Bleeding wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Many believed it released sin or madness. Some insisted it must be done on certain days of the month, aligned with the moon. Astrological charts even dictated which parts of the body were governed by which planets, and where bleeding would be most effective. Ilse ignored the stars. She listened to the body, but cutting was only part of the horror. Pus was another. Abscesses, boils, ulcers, these were common in a world without hygiene. Farmers came to her, with swollen hands, the flesh tender and pink. She'd slice into the boil, press it open, and let the infection drain. The smell was unbearable. The sound, the slow hiss of fluid escaping haunted her. She cleaned the wounds with vinegar or wine, packed them with crushed garlic or salt. Some she covered in honey, known even then for its antibacterial properties. The patient would scream, some vomit, but a day later they could move their fingers again. One day, a boy barely 10 came to her with a leg wound, so infected the skin around it pulsed like a second heart. She opened it. Green pus spilled across her lap. He didn't even cry, just stared at her shaking. She didn't sleep that night, not because of guilt, but because she feared it would happen again. And it did. Many times. Medieval infection was often a death sentence. Sepsis had no name. Gangrene was a slow rot, with no cure. Antibiotics were 6 centuries away. All Ilse could do was delay the inevitable. Amputations were rare and only attempted by barber surgeons. Rough men with stronger arms than morals, but even they called on healers afterward for poultices and prayers. A limb removed wasn't the end of the danger. The wound often killed faster than the injury. One harrowing winter, a man lost 3 fingers to frostbite. Ilse had no choice but to remove the blackened tips. She wrapped his hand in hot cloth, fed him poppy syrup until he could barely speak, and then used a red-hot iron to cauterize the stumps. His screams echoed across the village, but he lived. His wife never spoke to her again. The brutality of her work was hidden behind the calm of her voice, the neatness of her jars, but in truth, healing was it was blood on the floor, pus on her hands, and teeth marks on leather straps where patients bit down to keep from biting off their own tongues. She never flinched, not anymore. Because flinching meant hesitating, and hesitation meant death. And still, villagers assumed her job was mixing teas and humming spells. They had no idea. They didn't see the abscesses split like rotten fruit, the infected wounds that squirmed with worms, the ulcers that leaked a stink so foul it brought flies before the sun even rose. Ilse saw it all, and did what she could. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But she always tried, because no one else would. The air in Ilse's workroom always held a sharpness to it, not just from the vinegar she used for cleaning or the dried thyme hanging from the rafters, but from blood, old and new. It clung to the floorboards, soaked into the wooden tools, stained the linens she boiled weekly. No matter how clean she kept her hands, the smell never left them. You could tell a healer not by her herbs, but by the scent of iron on her skin. Bleeding, draining, lancing, these were not exotic procedures, they were routine, the rhythm of rural survival. Villagers didn't gasp at the sight of blood. They expected it. When an illness struck hard, they often insisted upon it. "Let the badness out," they'd say. It was a phrase that lingered in Ilse's mind, as if the body itself harbored secrets too dangerous to contain. She tried when possible to explain things gently. The swelling means the flesh is fighting, she once told a mother as she opened her daughter's boil with a heated needle. The child shrieked, the mother wept, but the fever broke by morning. Ilse didn't get thanks, just a bundle of onions left on her doorstep. She considered that payment enough. Medieval beliefs about pus were peculiar. They called it laudable pus, the good kind, especially in wound healing. Thick yellow-white discharge was seen as a sign the body was pushing out illness. Modern science calls it infection. Ilse too came to suspect that some kinds of pus meant death was close, not retreating, but she dared not speak that aloud. If a wound ran clear and red, she celebrated quietly. If it festered green and thick, she prepared the family. She had no gloves, no masks, no antiseptic. Her tools were sterilized by heat or wiped with spirits if she had them, but more often, she used wine, urine or salt water, whatever was at hand. She cut with bone knives, sharpened steel, sometimes even fish spines if nothing else was available. Each tool had its place, cleaned with trembling hands after each use. She could not afford mistakes, not in a place where infection traveled faster than gossip. In cities, barber surgeons might have assistants, but Ilse worked alone. Her hands did everything, cutting, pressing, binding. If the patient thrashed, she straddled their limbs, or called for a neighbor to hold them down. The screams that rang through her hut were common enough that villagers stopped reacting to them. It was just the healer at work. Interesting fact, tooth extraction was one of the most frequent minor surgeries performed by folk healers. Ilse hated doing it, but when a man's face swelled with abscess and his eye began to close, There was no other choice. She would boil her forceps, wedge the jaw open with a wooden peg, and pray the root came out clean. It rarely did. Pain was not something to be avoided. It was expected, embraced even. Some believed it was necessary to prove that the illness had been drawn out. The louder the patient screamed, the more likely the remedy was working. Ilse didn't believe this, but she let them think it. Comfort was half the cure, but the pain never left her. She felt it in her back after hours of leaning over limp bodies, in her fingers, swollen and cracked from scrubbing blood from clothes and splinters from under nails, in her chest when a patient looked at her, not with trust but desperation. She wasn't their healer, she was their final gamble. She had seen things that stayed with her like ghosts. A boy with a severed ear, chewed by pigs while he slept. A woman whose leg split open from an untreated dog bite, black with decay. A farmer whose foot had rotted from a splinter he ignored until the skin peeled away like bark. She treated them all. She succeeded sometimes, she failed more often than she admitted. And yet, every time she prepared her workspace, as if the outcome would be different. She boiled the cloth. She prayed under her breath, not to saints, but to silence. She lined up her tools, shook out her herbs, tied her apron tight. There were rituals too, little ones. She always used her left hand to cut first. Always said the patient's name aloud 3 times before beginning, not because she believed it brought luck, but because it brought focus. When you lived in the shadows of blood and pus, you needed something to hold on to. She had been asked to perform things no healer should. One man in the grip of fever madness begged her to bleed him until the voices stopped. Another asked her to cut open his belly to release the worms. She refused both. They died anyway, and in the weeks after she heard whispers. She didn't do enough. She could have tried. She let them die. They didn't understand. They never would. Interesting fact, some medieval texts recommended bleeding according to zodiac signs. Aries governed the head, so bleeding for headaches was done during other signs to avoid celestial imbalance. While urban physicians followed these charts religiously, rural healers like Ilse often dismissed them as distractions. If a man was dying, she wouldn't wait for Venus to pass into Pisces. Sometimes she worked alongside barbers or village butchers, men with strong arms, who could restrain or slice cleanly, but they lacked her finesse. They made deep wounds, careless cuts, left tendons severed or vessels torn. Ilse patched what they ruined, quietly, carefully, often without thanks. She kept no trophies, no records. Her legacy was in the villagers who limped instead of perished, in the mothers who carried babies because she turned a breach, in the elderly who lived another winter thanks to a boiled root and a poultice. She didn't need applause, she needed rest, but rest rarely came. There was always another cry, another knock at the door, another fever, and always more blood.
Chapter 5. The Midwife's Trial. Ilse had never called herself a midwife. It wasn't a title she claimed, it was a duty she inherited. In the eyes of the village, if you were a healer, you were also a midwife. There was no division, no specialization. A screaming woman in labor didn't ask for your credentials. She asked for your hands, and so Ilse's hands delivered babies. Medieval childbirth was not the warm, candlelit moment described in modern tales. It was blood and screams and sometimes silence. Women gave birth on their knees, or crouched on straw-strewn floors, or gripping the bedposts while other women held them from behind. There were no doctors. Men were rarely allowed. The birthing chamber belonged to women, and among them the midwife reigned. But with reign came responsibility and blame. When the baby came out blue and limp, they looked at her. When the mother bled too much and collapsed, they whispered her name with suspicion. She had seen it happen to others. One midwife from a nearby village was dragged before the bailiff after 3 infants died in a month. They said she had spoken Latin during birth. They called it a charm. She was whipped and banished. Ilse kept quiet when she worked. She believed in rhythm over words. The rhythm of breath, the pacing of labor, the steady beat of her own pulse as she pressed her fingers to a woman's belly, feeling for the child's position. A baby turned the wrong way meant hours of pain and often death. If she could coax it into position by herbs, massage or pure instinct, she could save 2 lives. She had learned from observation. Her mother had delivered dozens of children before her, and Ilse had stood in the corner watching with wide eyes, listening to the prayers, the curses, the pleading. She remembered the smells, sweat, blood, panic. Nothing ever left her. One night she was called to a birth during a thunderstorm. The woman, named Anna, had already labored 2 days. Her feet were swollen. her face pale. The baby was stuck. Ilse knelt between trembling legs, listening for the quiet moments between contractions. She pushed gently, then firmly. She rubbed olive oil on the woman's thighs. She whispered encouragement. The baby came finally, limp and silent. Ilse rubbed its back, blew into its mouth, pinched its feet. A minute passed, then two. At the edge of despair, the baby gasped. The family called it a miracle. Ilse didn't argue, but not every story ended that way. There was Elspeth, a mother of 5 who labored all day, only for the baby to come too early, too small, too fragile. It died before the cord could be tied. Elspeth survived, but barely. She wept for weeks. And later, when her husband's crops failed, he blamed the healer. A cursed hand, he muttered at the tavern. She brings death. Interesting fact. Medieval midwives were sometimes required to take oaths in front of priests, swearing they would not perform baptisms, hide miscarriages, or speak charms during birth. But outside major towns, these rules were unenforced. In most rural villages, midwives worked without oversight, respected one day, accused the next. Ilse's work began long before the first cry. She prepared herbal teas for pregnant women, raspberry leaf to tone the womb, nettle for strength, and chamomile for calm. She massaged sore backs. She monitored swelling, changes in appetite, sudden pain. She taught women to squat, to breathe, to stay warm. And when the time came, she boiled water, laid out cloth, lit fires, and waited. Birth, for all its wonder, was also death's closest companion. Bleeding couldn't be stopped once it began in earnest. There were no transfusions, no clamps. Ilse packed linen into torn wounds. She tied the cord tight. She whispered prayers, even when she had stopped believing, anything to slow the bleeding. And when it didn't work, she held the mother's hand and stayed until the end. The village always noticed her presence. They watched the hut where she worked, counted how many came out alive. They judged in silence. If too many funerals followed her visits, they stopped calling her altogether. And when the next labor came, they'd call her again anyway, because fear was a luxury. Ilse was necessity. Sometimes, in the rare warmth of an easy birth, she allowed herself a smile. When a baby cried strong, latched quickly, kicked its legs with vigor, she felt a flicker of joy. She would wash the mother, clean the child, wrap both in soft linen, and step into the cold air outside feeling almost human. But most of the time she just felt tired, not from the work, but from the Interesting fact, some medieval midwives carried tools like birthing hooks, forceps, or sharp blades. Though many feared them, they were considered last resorts. In rural areas, most births relied on natural techniques, binding cloths, warm compresses, and the midwife's hands. The margin for error was razor thin. Ilse knew she walked a line each time she entered a birthing room. If she saved them, she was tolerated. If she lost them, she was cursed. And yet she never turned down a call. She carried stories in her hands, some hopeful, some horrific, but all necessary. And in a world where few remembered women's names after they died, Ilse's work ensured they were not forgotten, not by the husbands, or the children, or the graves they left behind. Ilse sometimes wondered if the ground remembered all the women who had bled into it. Birth for her had never been a miracle. It was risk. Every cry, every push, every silence between screams. It was a negotiation between life and death. One slip and the scale tipped. One slow breath, and a mother vanished. She had watched it happen too many times to romanticize it. She respected childbirth, but she did not trust it. The villagers didn't talk about it much. They celebrated births with meat and bread and wine. They mourned with quick burials and soft hymns. But the act itself, the way a woman's body tore to bring forth life, the way the baby emerged slick with blood and fluid, fists clenched against a cold world, none of it was spoken aloud. That part belonged only to the midwife, and she carried it like a wound. Ilse knew things others didn't. She knew the signs of a breech birth, just by the bulge of a belly. She knew when a mother was too small, too weak, too young. Girls married at 12, sometimes younger. They bore children before their hips had widened, before their bodies had hardened. She'd seen more than one girl tear from pelvis to thigh, screaming for a mother who had also died giving birth. The village called it God's will. Ilse called it cruelty. There were times when she had to make choices no woman should ever face. If the baby was trapped, limbs twisted or tangled in the cord, and the mother was dying, what did she do? In towns with surgeons, crude cesareans might be attempted, but in villages like hers that was impossible. There were no surgical tools, no anesthetic, no hope. She could only pray for one life to be spared. Once she used a thin iron hook to extract a stillborn child piece by piece. The mother lived but never spoke again. Ilse buried the pieces herself alone, behind the chapel wall. The villagers said nothing, they didn't want to know, but they never looked at her the same again. Interesting fact, medieval midwives were sometimes prosecuted for using forbidden instruments. Hooks, knives and even forceps, though rare, were seen as suspect. Many believed birth should happen naturally, or not at all. To intervene too forcefully was to interfere with God's plan. Ilse didn't care about plans, she cared about breathing lungs and beating hearts. Her methods were crude, but she was careful. She boiled linens, burned sweet herbs to cleanse the air, rubbed her hands with salt before touching a newborn. She didn't know the word antiseptic, but she knew the smell of death, and she did what she could to delay it. She had enemies, though no one said it to her face. One local priest believed women like her were dangerous. They claim knowledge that belongs to men of God, he'd said once during Mass. They whisper in shadows, they touch with impure hands. He never named her directly, but everyone knew. She sat in the back after that, stopped going altogether soon after. It was the same pattern. When she succeeded, they said she was gifted. When she failed, they said she dabbled in darkness. There was no safe ground between. She had seen women die slowly, bleeding for hours. She had seen others go in an instant, their heads thrown back in surprise, eyes wide. She had seen babies born with 2 heads or none, with twisted limbs or no breath. Each time she wrapped them carefully in linen and carried them away. If the family asked, she buried them quietly. If they didn't, she still did. Someone had to. Some women came to her not for birth, but for the opposite. A delayed cycle, a swollen belly they couldn't explain. They came at night, cloaked and shaking. Ilse offered teas, pennyroyal, tansy, mugwort, knowing what they asked without saying it aloud. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but she understood. In a world where a child could mean death, or ruin, or shame, choice was the only mercy she could offer. Interesting fact, abortion was a complex issue in the medieval period. While the church condemned it, quickening, the first felt movement of the fetus, was often seen as the threshold. Before that, many midwives and healers administered herbs to regulate cycles. It was a gray area filled with silence. Ilse knew the risk. If someone died, if a husband suspected, if the priest caught wind, she could be hanged, or worse, but she never refused. Her job wasn't to judge, it was to help. She kept no records, only memory. The face of the girl who thanked her with tears in her eyes, the woman who never came back, the boy born after 3 sisters longed for and strong, the child who didn't cry until Ilse sang to it. These memories didn't fade, they haunted her, but they also gave her purpose. One night, after delivering twins to a carpenter's wife, she sat by the fire, hands trembling. Both babies were alive, the mother was safe. It was a good night, rare, and yet she cried, not from sorrow but from release. She had done the impossible, and no one would ever understand how hard it had been. She wrapped her tools in cloth, the same cloth she had used for years. She drank chamomile tea alone, and she whispered the babies' names to herself, to remember them because no one else would. In the morning they would call her again, and she would go. Chapter 6, Witches, Saints and Suspicion. Ilse never saw herself as dangerous, but by the time the villagers began crossing themselves when she passed, it was clear they thought otherwise. Not always, not publicly, but in glances, in muttered warnings, in children pulled away by cautious mothers. She'd felt it subtle at first, then colder, heavier, and still they came to her when their children wouldn't stop coughing. Still they knocked when a labor dragged on too long. Need was stronger than suspicion, but only just. In medieval Europe, suspicion wasn't a flicker of doubt, it was a kindling spark, and for women like Ilse, one spark could burn a life to ash. The line between healer and heretic was razor thin. One moment, you were a wise woman, the next a witch, the difference, a failed remedy, an untimely death, a jealous priest, or a rumor delivered to the wrong ears. No law protected her, no title insulated her. She was tolerated until she wasn't. It had happened before. A healer in a neighboring village had been dragged from her hut, accused of cursing a man's fields. He had suffered a stroke, but his family claimed it was no accident.
She gave him tea, they said. The next day he fell. That was enough. They bound her wrists. She was never seen again. Ilsa kept her remedies discreet after that. She had always been careful. She avoided mixing herbalism with obvious ritual. She kept saints' candles near her tinctures. Let villagers see her hang crosses above her doorway, not because she believed in them, but because the absence would invite questions. A healer could not afford questions. Interesting fact, inquisitions varied by region and era, but by the 15th century, women healers were increasingly targeted. Accusations didn't always require evidence, just testimonies, rumors and moral panic. Folk knowledge, especially when passed through generations of women, was viewed as subversive to church authority. Ilsa had watched this slow turn. In her childhood, healers were respected, even revered. But with every new edict, every whispered sermon, things changed. The church grew more powerful. Male physicians gained favor. Anything outside that structure was branded suspect. She heard the sermons. Only God heals, the priest would declare. Beware those who claim power over life and death. The villagers would nod, then slip her payment for a remedy as they left. Their hypocrisy didn't offend her. It frightened her, because all it took was one death. A child, a beloved elder, a wife, and the grief needed somewhere to go. If prayer failed, and the body still failed, they looked for a reason. And Ilsa, with her hidden jars and her muttered instructions, was too easy a target. To guard herself, she invoked saints in her treatments. Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Margaret for childbirth. She even kept a small carved Madonna, worn smooth by handling. When applying salve, she murmured their names, not as invocations, but as armor. If someone overheard, they'd hear faith, not blasphemy. But her remedies still bordered on the unholy in the eyes of some. She used wolfsbane to numb pain, belladonna in microdoses to relax muscles. These weren't safe, but they worked. And when something works, it threatens the powerful. She once cured a steward's son of night terrors using valerian root, goat's milk, and soft chanting. The priest claimed it was the boy's renewed faith that banished the demons. But the steward thanked Ilsa in private, gave her a silver coin, told her not to mention. That was always the way. Praise in shadows, silence in the light. And then there were the dreams. Women came to her with dreams they couldn't explain. Bad ones, repeated ones. Some said they saw crows, fire, dark figures. Ilsa offered teas, whispered advice, burned herbs to calm their sleep. But she was careful never to interpret dreams. That was divination, and divination meant charges. There was a girl named Marta once, barely 14. She'd suffered fits after waking from strange dreams. The villagers called it possession. The priest tried prayers. Ilsa tried sage smoke and motherwort. The girl improved, but the family never admitted it was Ilsa who had helped. They feared the priest more. Dark fact. In many areas, healers who used charms, dreamwork or astrology were more likely to be accused of witchcraft, even when the same methods were used by clergy under different names. The difference wasn't the ritual, it was who performed it. Ilsa kept her knowledge to herself. She had no apprentices, no daughters. Her memory was her safeguard. She didn't write her recipes down. Writing made them permanent, and permanence made them dangerous. She once burned a whole basket of labeled herbs, after a villager died unexpectedly. He had taken her remedy for fever, and collapsed days later. She didn't know if it was her tincture or his age, but she didn't wait to find out. She removed every jar from her shelf. She buried the rest. That night she didn't sleep. Even her garden was suspect. When the flowers bloomed too early, someone muttered witch's soil. When a dog died after sniffing her compost heap, they avoided her path for weeks. She tried not to mind, but every stare, every turned shoulder, chipped away at her resolve. She stopped attending feast days. Too many eyes, too many questions. She let the villagers come to her in secret. Quiet knocks at dusk, requests left at her door. She became a shadow in their lives, a useful shadow, but not a trusted one. And that was safer. Ilsa's footsteps were soft on the dirt path, but they still echoed in the minds of those who watched from behind curtains. The healer's hut, once a place of desperate hope, now stood like a border post between healing and heresy. Those who visited her did so under cover of dusk, heads bowed low, voices hushed. No one wanted to be seen seeking her help, but they still came, because sickness did not respect sermons. The irony was bitter. The same villagers who once begged for her poultices, and trusted her with the lives of their infants, were now the ones whispering in corners. She keeps bones beneath her bed, someone said. She talks to herself when the moon is high, said another. No one had seen these things. They didn't need to. In a world ruled by fear, stories were more powerful than facts. Ilsa learned to move with precision. Every word she spoke in public was measured. Every smile was small. She never touched children unless asked. She never spoke first in the market. She paid for everything in coin, never herbs, never trade. If she was to survive, she had to be beyond reproach, even though she worked in shadows. Interesting fact, the church allowed healing only when it was divinely inspired, which meant healers, especially women, had to perform their work while appearing modest, humble and secondary to God. Confidence or deep knowledge could be misread as pride or worse. Source. To protect herself, Ilsa kept a crucifix near her herbs. She offered Saint Benedict's prayer during difficult birth. She sometimes repeated psalms she barely remembered just to keep her lips. She sometimes repeated psalms she barely remembered just to keep her lips moving when villagers watched. She wasn't praying for the soul, she was praying for safety. Still, the suspicion came like a creeping fog. It was slow, thick, inescapable. One day, a pig fell ill and the farmer blamed her compost heap. Another day, a woman miscarried after taking Ilsa's fever tea. Though it had been safely used dozens of times before, the priest whispered from the pulpit, "Some among us have wandered too close to Eve's sin, desiring forbidden knowledge." He didn't name her, he didn't have to. And then came the child. A girl barely 7, collapsed in the square during market day. Convulsions took her body. Her mouth frothed. She screamed in tongues. The villagers froze. Then someone shouted, "The healer! Fetch the healer!" Ilsa came, fast as her legs could carry her. She pushed through the crowd, knelt beside the child, checked her pulse, her breath, her eyes. Fever, likely a seizure from a long illness. She brewed willow bark, placed cool cloths on the girl's forehead, and rubbed lavender on her wrists. The girl calmed by sunset. But the priest arrived the next morning. He stood in Ilsa's garden, flanked by 2 men with rope at their belts. "We've heard," he said, "that you use roots not mentioned in scripture." She stood silent. "We've heard," he continued, "that your hands move without God's blessing." Her pulse raced. "We will investigate." Ilsa said only one word, "Fine." They searched her hut. They examined her herbs. They found nothing unusual. No bones, no dead birds, no symbols, only dried roots, oils, linens, teas. The priest took her crucifix anyway. "You don't deserve this," he said. "Not if you don't believe." They left without arresting her, but the message was clear. Interesting fact, while witch trials were more prominent in the 15th to 17th centuries, the groundwork was laid centuries earlier. Suspicion often began with local priests, jealous physicians, or grieving relatives. A healer had no institutional protection. Even a simple herbal remedy could become evidence of demonic collusion. After that day, her visits dwindled. Some villagers stopped coming entirely, others came more secretively than before. She was still needed, but now she was feared more than ever. And then one cold morning, she found a crude symbol etched into her door, a circle with an X in the center, known in some regions as a witch mark. It wasn't church-sanctioned, it was a villager's mark, an anonymous threat. She stood staring at it for a long time. That night she dug up half her garden. She burned her riskier herbs, belladonna, hemlock, wormwood. She cried as the smoke filled the air. It wasn't just plants she burned, it was knowledge. Centuries of passed down learning, turned to ash out of fear. But she kept her mortar and pestle, she kept her hands, and she kept her resolve. Because even when they turned against her, she knew the truth. Their faith didn't stop disease, their saints didn't stop bleeding, their priests didn't know how to reset a broken bone or turn a breech baby. She did. And she would not be silent, not entirely. She continued her work, quietly, cautiously, without praise, without trust, but with purpose. Because to be a healer in the medieval world was not just to fight sickness, it was to fight ignorance, to fight fear, and most of all, to survive.
Chapter 7. The Church's Cold Stare. Ilsa had long known that the Church did not like her. They tolerated her in good seasons, when harvests were strong, when children were born healthy, when illness kept its distance. But in times of hardship, their patience thinned like worn cloth. And each time the wind turned cold, she felt the weight of their attention, colder still. Not from the villagers who relied on her, but from the men in robes, the stewards of God's truth, who viewed her knowledge as a rival scripture. She had sat in the back of the chapel for years, silent beneath the vaulted timber beams. She never took communion. She wasn't welcome at the altar, but she listened, heard the tone, the cadence, the subtle warnings woven into sermons. The Lord heals through the righteous, Father Matthias once declared, eyes drifting toward her without fully turning. Those who heal by other means tempt darkness. No one turned to look. They didn't need to. Everyone understood. It wasn't just distrust. It was jurisdiction. The church viewed healing as a spiritual act, something granted through saints, relics, and sacraments. Illness in their view was a test of faith, a punishment for sin or a cleansing fire sent by God. To intervene with herbs, oils, and rituals was to interfere with divine will. That's where the battle began, not between science and magic, but between dogma and practicality. Ilse didn't challenge them. She couldn't. She was a woman, unlettered, without titles. But she knew her place in the pecking order. Monks studied books and bled noblemen behind stone walls. Priests anointed the dying. Surgeons cut in town squares. But when a shepherd's wife began coughing blood, or a child convulsed beside the hearth, it wasn't the friar they called, it was her, and that bruised pride. Interesting fact, by the 12th century, church authorities had begun regulating medical practice. The Council of Tours 116.3 declared that clergy should not engage in the shedding of blood, effectively pushing surgery and hands-on healing into secular hands. But the church still claimed authority over the spiritual dimensions of illness, and often over who could treat it. Ilse's hands didn't tremble when she worked, but they sometimes did when she crossed the chapel threshold, not out of guilt, but out of foresight. She knew that if something went wrong, no saint would protect her. She had no Latin, no allies, only results. She tried to appease. She hung a rosary by her window. She muttered the Lord's Prayer when treating the dying. She even planted blessed thistle outside her door, a nod to tradition and perhaps to superstition. But it was never enough. The priest sent warnings in the form of questions. Do you still practice remedies? Have you considered confession? Do you ever wonder whether your knowledge was meant to be yours? Ilse answered without lies. I help where I can. That wasn't what he wanted to hear. The tension worsened after a strange winter. Illness swept through the village, fevers, coughing, aching joints. The priest blamed sin. He led a procession through the streets, swinging incense, chanting prayers. Ilse brewed elderflower, made poultices from nettle and ash. She stayed up 4 nights treating the sick. Most recovered, a few did not. When spring came, Father Matthias gave a sermon denouncing those who confuse healing with rebellion. He reminded the congregation that no woman could hold sacred knowledge without divine sanction. Afterward he visited her hut, and asked pointedly, "Why do you still do this work, Ilse?" She met his gaze, "Because no one else will." The priest left without another word, but he began sending others. A deacon came weeks later, asking to inspect her tools. She refused, said they could watch her work but not ransack her home. He left frustrated. Another came claiming to bless the sick she was treating. The patient, an elderly widow with sores on her back, flinched at his touch. She asked for Ilse instead. That night, Ilse found chicken bones scattered at her doorstep, a crude curse meant to mock or warn. She buried them and said nothing. Interesting fact, despite growing suspicion of women healers, monasteries often held some of the best libraries of medical texts, copied from Arabic or Greek sources. The hypocrisy was clear. Men of the church studied medicine in cloistered silence, while women practicing healing were accused of witchcraft for the same knowledge applied aloud. Ilse knew her remedies had once been copied from abbesses and nuns. Hildegard of Bingen, after all, had written of wormwood and fennel, of mugwort and lungwort. But Hildegard wore a wimple. Ilse wore dirt. That was the difference. Sometimes she dreamed of confronting them, telling the priest that God wasn't the only one who could soothe a fever, that if he cared so much he might teach the clergy how to treat infections instead of exorcising them. But she knew better. They didn't want healing, they wanted obedience, and obedience was never her craft. She continued to work, though the eyes on her grew sharper. She healed more than the priest forgave. That was her real crime, not pride, not heresy, effectiveness. When a young man collapsed with a festering wound after falling on a rusted nail, the church offered prayers. Ilse drained the wound and saved the leg. His family gave thanks at Mass, not to her but to Saint Roch. No one mentioned the poultice. That was her place in the village. essential, but erased. The church didn't need to burn her, they simply outlasted her. They made her fade, but even as the sermons grew louder, even as her name became a warning, Ilse remained at her table, grinding dried leaves into powder, tying bundles of sage, watching the horizon for the next illness, the next knock, the next chance to help. Because though the church watched her with cold eyes, the people still came, and she would answer, always. Ilse never expected gratitude from the church, but neither had she expected to be hunted by silence. It was one thing to be openly condemned, to face the fire of sermons or the bite of accusations. But what chilled her more was the absence, the slow exclusion. She no longer received the smallest nods from the altar. Her name was never uttered, even when her work saved the very bodies kneeling on chapel stones. Her presence was tolerated the way a bad season was, an inconvenience to endure, not a servant of God. She understood, now, that the church didn't fear her because she failed. They feared her because she succeeded. In a world where miracles were currency and saints had monopolies on recovery, the village healer was bad for business. Each cough soothed by a poultice, each swelling eased with crushed herbs, was one less prayer answered by holy intercession. And though no priest would ever say it aloud, every time she succeeded, she weakened their grip. Still, she never spoke out, not publicly, not against the church. Instead, she focused on her work. She stitched torn skin, drained abscesses, eased pain during the plague of ulcers that came with early autumn. She tended to monks themselves, quietly, discreetly, behind stone walls when they called for help in the dead of night. Ilse never boasted. She simply showed up, hands steady, eyes low. One friar once whispered to her, "You're braver than you know." She didn't respond. He died of infection 3 days later. Interesting fact, church doctrine held that illness was often the result of sin or divine punishment. Especially in the early medieval period, confession and repentance were as central to healing as medicine. Many priests resisted earthly cures unless accompanied by prayer, fasting, or pilgrimage. This ideological grip created deep conflict between practical healers and spiritual authorities. Even nuns, who were sometimes allowed to operate infirmaries within convents, faced scrutiny. If they healed too well or too often, the suspicion began. Authority, especially in the hands of a woman, had to appear granted, not earned. And Ilse had earned every drop of hers. She remembered the first time a villager refused her help outright. A man named Gottfried had fallen from a ladder, dislocated his shoulder. His wife called for her, but as she reached for her sling and herbs, he snarled, "I'd rather the priest." 2 days later he was dead of fever. The priest blamed the Lord's judgment. The wife said nothing, but Ilse knew the truth. She could have saved him, but she wasn't allowed, and yet the same priest visited her weeks later with a boil on his thigh, red and pulsing. "I need discretion," he said. She didn't flinch. She didn't spit. She treated him, lanced the boil, drained the pus, dressed it in honey and wool. She didn't ask for payment, but she remembered. She kept records, not on paper, too dangerous, but in her mind. Who came in secret, who scorned her in public, who crossed themselves after taking her tea, the dual lives they lived, and the lie they all told together. But not all churchmen were her enemies. A few quietly admired her. Brother Thomas, the monastery gardener, once offered her cuttings of rosemary and hyssop from behind the cloister gate. "For balance," he said. She understood. The ones who worked the earth knew the truth of it. Plants healed. Dirt taught. Not all divinity came from parchment. Still, even they kept their distance in daylight. She longed for someone to say it plainly, that her work mattered, that her cures were not evil. But in this world, silence was safety and truth was dangerous, and so she kept her head down. Interesting fact, many folk healers were denied burial in consecrated ground. Even those who had served their communities for decades were often buried outside village walls in the same plots as criminals, unbaptized infants, and those who died by suicide. It was not enough to heal, one had to die approved. Ilse accepted this. She knew no tombstone would bear her name, but the lives she saved, those were her markers. The children who ran without wheeze, the women who lived to bear again, the men who limped instead of lay in pine boxes. But there was a cost. The church's growing disapproval meant she had to narrow her practice. No more dream work, no more charms. She stopped advising on miscarriages. She stopped administering certain herbs altogether. If a woman came to her with a question too bold, she simply shook her head. "I'm sorry," she'd whisper. "I can't help." The guilt ate at her, but it was survival.
One day, an old woman named Brigida visited her, sobbing. Her grandson had a rash, hot, red spreading. Ilse knew what it was. St. Anthony's fire, a reaction to moldy rye. She gave her balm, cool cloths and advice. Keep him from bread, she warned. But the priest visited that evening and declared it a test from the Lord. He insisted on a relic touching the child's skin. 3 days later the boy was dead. Ilse was never asked back. She sat alone that night, staring into her hearth, wondering how long she had before her hands became too dangerous for the living. But even then she didn't stop. She knew the church's cold stare could not bind her hands forever, because healing, real healing, didn't need permission. It only needed someone willing to act, even when unseen, even when unwelcome. And she had always been willing. Chapter 8. The plague comes. The first signs were easy to miss. A swollen node beneath the arm, a small black blister near the groin, a fever that came fast and burned hot. A man in the next village dropped dead on his way to market. A boy collapsed in the field, coughing blood, his lips the color of ash. At first the villagers called it a punishment, a bad wind, a curse from a distant city. Ilse called it something else in the privacy of her thoughts. It was 3048, when the Black Death reached her part of the world. It had begun far away east of the seas, they said, in cities where merchants traded silk and spice. But now it came on foot, hidden in fleas clinging to rats, riding in grain sacks and wool bundles. It traveled in silence, and it killed with speed. Ilse had heard the rumors before it arrived. Whole towns emptied overnight, monasteries abandoned, priests falling at the altar, even doctors, men in robes, who once mocked women like her, now fled or died with their remedies unopened. If they couldn't stop it, what hope did she have? Still, she stayed. When the first corpse was found near the river, legs bent awkwardly, skin mottled with black boils, no priest dared touch it. The church sent prayers from a distance. The bailiff suggested burning the corpse, but it was Ilse who approached, covered in layers of wool, her face wrapped in cloth, soaked in vinegar. She poured lye on the body, dug with her own hands, lit the pyre herself. By nightfall 5 more were dead. The healer's home, once a quiet refuge, became a place of chaos. People came coughing, weeping, gasping for breath. Some begged for herbs, others for mercy. Ilse worked around the clock, steeping elderberry, mixing garlic paste, burning sage and rosemary in the air. She washed linens in vinegar. She stuffed door cracks with hay. None of it worked. The plague did not behave like other sicknesses. It came in forms, some rapid, some slow, bubonic, with swollen buboes and aching limbs, pneumonic, with wet lungs and bloody sputum, septicemic, with sudden collapse, cold limbs, and death before sunset. Each variant moved faster than she could think. Interesting fact, medieval theories for the plague's cause varied wildly. Bad air, miasma, divine punishment, planetary misalignment, or poisoned wells. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats, would not be discovered until centuries later. Healers like Ilse relied on observation, intuition, and desperate ritual. She tried everything. She crushed wormwood into tea, burned juniper, hung herbs from doorways. She bled the sick with trembling hands, though it often made them worse. She boiled ruined thyme in wine, made charcoal poultices, rubbed vinegar and rosewater on the skin. Sometimes a person recovered. More often they didn't. Death didn't knock politely. It stormed in. Whole families perished in a day. Children died in their sleep. Mothers wailed until their throats bled. Dogs roamed the streets, dragging bodies they'd sniffed out. The grave diggers fled. The church bell rang so often it cracked. And yet, Ilse did not run. She knew her limits. She knew she couldn't cure it, but she could comfort. She could clean wounds, cool fevers, and whisper gently as eyes dimmed. She could hold the hand of the dying when no one else would. And still the village turned on her. They said she brought the sickness with her roots, and dried flowers. They said her jars leaked curses. A man whose wife died in her arms threw a stone through her window. A child screamed when he saw her approaching. One woman, fever-mad, called her the devil's wife. Ilse didn't argue. She barely spoke, because she too was afraid. She feared not for her soul but for the silence that followed death. The way a house felt when the bodies were gone. The sound of a baby's cradle rocking in an empty room. The way the air grew thick with rot and memory. She buried more than she healed. Each grave was dug behind her home, near the forest's edge. She marked them with stones, said no prayers, just whispered their names to the wind. and let the trees remember. She could not risk burying them in the village. The priest refused last rites for plague victims. Their sins are their burden, he had said. We cannot pollute consecrated ground. Ilse said nothing. She had begun coughing, not often, just in the morning. A tightness in the chest, a blackness behind the eyes, but she ignored it. There were still the living. A boy with swollen glands, a girl with boils under her arms, a mother too weak to stand. She made tinctures with trembling hands. Her lips cracked, her legs ached, but she didn't stop. Interesting fact, during the height of the plague, some healers adopted rituals not from faith, but from folklore, burning clothing, chanting protective phrases, drawing chalk circles. These were not superstitions to them, they were hope given form, desperation carved into action. Ilse began hanging garlic from her rafters, not for scent, but for fear. She tied bundles of dried mint to her belt. She stopped sleeping. She drank elderberry and honey to keep her throat soothed, but inside she knew, she couldn't fight what she didn't understand. No one could, but she could show the dying that they were not alone, and sometimes, that was enough. By the third week the village no longer pretended to sleep. Doors stayed bolted even in daylight. No candles flickered behind window panes. Chickens roamed free, uncollected eggs rotting beneath nests. Smoke rose only from chimneys marked with white cloth. Those who were already touched, who had either surrendered to the fever, or were counting days. Death had become a neighbor, not a stranger. Ilse still walked the road. She wore a thick cloak, soaked daily in vinegar and water. Her sleeves were long and stiff from dried tincture. A cloth mask, crudely stuffed with dried sage and mint, wrapped around her nose and mouth. Not because she believed it would save her, but because it gave her the illusion of doing something. The smell of rot, of decay and sweat, and hopelessness, was everywhere. She preferred to filter it. She had stopped bleeding patients. The fever was too fast, too furious. Bloodletting weakened them. Sometimes it hastened death. She tried instead to calm. Cloth soaked in cool water, elderberry and mint teas to ease the throat, charcoal poultices for boils, honey and garlic rubbed into open wounds. She prayed if not to saints, then to something more silent. They still died, some in agony, clawing at their own skin, fever-mad and screaming. Others went quietly, breath slowing until nothing moved. Infants died first, then the old, then the strong. She saw a man she'd known for years, a man who once mocked her for her roots and salves, cough blood onto her skirt and beg her not to leave him. She didn't, but the priest did. By mid-month, Father Matthias had fled. The chapel stood locked, its bells silent, its incense cold. The church left only pamphlets behind, handwritten prayers nailed to the chapel doors. Repent, fast, avoid sin, no more sacraments, no last rites, only fear. And so Ilse took their place. She wrapped the dead, she comforted the sick, she buried bodies by moonlight, she sprinkled salt on their faces and closed their eyes. She murmured whatever words she remembered from childhood, the Psalms, fragments of blessings, not for salvation, but for dignity. No one else would offer it. Interesting fact, during the Black Death, mortality rates soared so high that traditional funerary practices collapsed. In many villages, mass graves became common, and those who performed burials often lacked formal training. Women like Ilse, healers, midwives, and even widows took up roles once reserved for clergy, but not everyone was grateful. Some claimed she never got sick because she had cursed them. One man insisted she kept the souls of the dead in jars. A woman told her to stay away or she'd send her husband with pitch and blade. Ilse didn't answer. She returned home, shut the door, and wept, because she was getting sick. The coughing had worsened. Her joints burned at night, her skin ached beneath her clothes. She had lost the ability to taste. Her breath grew shallow on cold mornings. She told no one who would help her. She had prepared a tincture, not to cure but to end it, should it go too far. Poppy syrup, mandrake, enough to close her eyes gently. She kept it in a vial beneath her bed, wrapped in linen. She checked it nightly, counted the drops, but she never used it. Because even in pain there were still knocks on the door, a mother begging for her child, a man dragging his brother's limp body, a girl whose skin was hot to the touch, but whose eyes still held fear. And each time Ilse rose, wrapped her shawl tighter, lit her oil lamp, and went back into the night. What drove her wasn't faith, and it wasn't pride, it was duty, a deep unspoken truth. If she did not act, no one would, and that truth was heavier than the risk. She wrote nothing down, Not because she had no thoughts, but because there would be no one to read them. Her legacy would be in bones saved, in breath soothed, in graves dug gently. She accepted that. She had never needed applause. One night, a girl no older than 10 knocked on her door, barefoot and shaking. Her parents were dead. Her brother, she said, was sleeping cold. Ilse followed her. The cottage was empty. The air hung still. The boy lay curled in a blanket, his lips blue, his chest. Ilse sat beside him, rubbed his hand, and wept with the girl until the stars faded. She carried the boy outside, buried him beneath the old oak, said nothing. The girl stayed with her after that, slept on straw near the hearth. Ilse taught her to grind herbs, to boil water, to place warm cloths beneath arms. She never asked the girl's name. The girl never left. Together they tended to the living. Together they carried the dead. Interesting fact, in many plague-struck villages, children were left orphaned by the dozen. Some were absorbed by distant relatives. Others wandered, or starved. A rare few were taken in by healers and herbalists. Especially those without families of their own, passing knowledge through necessity, not lineage. When spring finally came, so did the silence. The death slowed, the coughing ceased, the roads filled again, life returned, slowly like grass through ash. But the village was smaller, the bells were gone, the chapel door remained shut, and Ilse somehow was still standing, thin, worn, haunted, but alive. And when the first woman came to her with a question about childbirth, Ilse smiled softly and said, "Boil water, and bring nettle tea." She had lived through the end of the world, and still the healer remained.
Chapter 9. Secrets of the Forest. When the village grew quiet again, when the coughing stopped and the black boils faded from memory, the healer turned to the woods. Ilse had always walked the forests, but now she entered them with a different rhythm, not as a gatherer but as a survivor. The plague had thinned the village like winter thins a herd. Those who remained moved cautiously, whispering old prayers louder, clinging to the church tighter. Some avoided her now entirely, even those she had saved. A few still came in the dark, but most averted their eyes. So she went where no one watched. The forest untamed, damn humming with flies and breath, and memory welcomed her as the village no longer did. There among the mosses and fallen trees, she found a different kind of medicine, and a different kind of peace. The forest had always been a paradox. To the church it was a place of sin and temptation. To the nobleman it was hunting ground. But to Ilse it was sanctuary, apothecary, library. Every path was lined with plants she'd once read through touch and taste. Now she returned to them as a student relearning her letters. She brought no basket, no tools. She wandered with open palms, brushing leaves, bending low to inspect mushrooms, peeling bark from trees. She'd lost her confidence in the plague. Too many bodies buried, too many remedies failed. But the forest didn't care. It whispered no judgment. It offered nettle and yarrow, birch resin and elderberries. Interesting fact, forests in medieval Europe were both feared and revered. They were believed to harbor demons and witches, but they were also sources of critical survival resources: fungi, wild herbs, medicinal barks, and clean water. Folk healers, especially women, often had extensive botanical knowledge sourced from forest wandering. There were legends, of course, ghosts of the unburied, shadowy figures with black eyes. Some villagers claimed to see the devil himself walking beneath the trees at dusk. Ilse had heard these tales from childhood. Now she walked where they feared. She welcomed the dark, not for mysticism but for solitude. She found reishi mushrooms growing on an oak, dried them slowly over weeks, boiled them for strength and resistance. She harvested birch bark for salves, found coltsfoot in damp ditches to ease coughs. These were not miracle cures, but they worked gently, consistently, and now she trusted nothing more than slow medicine. Once, deep in the glade, she stumbled upon a tree struck by lightning. It had split down the center, revealing pale, pulpy wood inside. At its base grew a ring of blood-red caps, mushrooms known to be dangerous, even fatal. She stared at them for a long time, then with trembling fingers collected two. She didn't intend to use them, but she kept them anyway, dried, labeled, stored in a separate pouch, not for healing but as a reminder that nature gave life and death with the same hand. She began to sleep in the forest some nights, wrapped in her cloak, back pressed to the base of a tree. The girl who had stayed with her during the plague, Lena, she'd finally told her name.
watched from the hut. Sometimes she joined her, sometimes not. Ilsa left food behind, left pages torn from leech books, written with charcoal tucked into tree hollows, as if speaking to something older than man. The villagers noticed her absence. One man muttered, "She's gone wild." Another said, "The trees talk to her." A third claimed he saw her barefoot, dancing by moonlight. None of it was true, but the stories grew. Stories always did. No one saw the nights she wept for the babies she couldn't save. No one saw the shaking hands that still rubbed salves into dying skin. They only saw a shadow among the trees. She was becoming folklore. Interesting fact, in late medieval folklore, many forest-dwelling women, especially older, unmarried ones, were labeled witches or spirits. These narratives often blurred real women with mythical beings, a reflection of both fear and awe. It was safer for the community to make them legend than to admit they depended on them. Ilsa didn't fight the stories, she let them spread. If the village feared her more than it loved her, that meant fewer knocks, fewer judgments. She could work in peace. And Lena was learning. She asked about each plant, each preparation. She learned to grind, to boil, to steep. Ilsa had not planned to teach, but now she found herself doing so. Quietly, line by line, root by root. The forest, in its eerie wisdom, had given her a new chapter, and it gave her the gift of remembering how to listen. When she found a fallen deer, untouched by rot, she knelt beside it, whispered an apology, took its bones not for charm or spell but to carve needles, to stitch wounds when metal was too costly. She cleaned them with fire, let them whiten in the sun, marked them with lines of ink, life, etched in death. At the edge of the forest she planted new herbs, ones not native to the region, seeds she'd saved from far places. Chamomile, borage, horehound. She wanted the grove to remember things the village had forgotten. That healing began in the dirt, not in doctrine. That medicine had no gender, no collar, only hands. She kept no shrine, but she left behind signs for those who came looking. Symbols carved into bark, directions to tease, to shelter, to knowledge. Not for the priest, not for the scribe, but for the next girl who walked alone, afraid of her own knowing. Because the healer's work was never only hers. It belonged to the trees now. The forest held her secrets better than the village ever could. When Ilsa walked beneath the ancient canopies where the moss grew thick and the air hung still, she didn't feel watched, not judged, not feared. The trees offered no sermons, the wind asked no questions. There were no crosses carved here, no bells to toll the dying, just soil and silence, and the quiet pulse of something older than both the church and the plague. She came here more often now, not just to gather but to grieve. The plague had passed, but the ghosts had not. She could still see their faces in her dreams, the ones she couldn't save. Their names sat on her tongue like bitter herbs. So she wrote them on bark, scratched into dead logs, whispered them to fern leaves, as she walked barefoot along the stream banks. She didn't expect the forest to answer, but it listened. That was enough. Lena followed her like a shadow, never far behind. The girl had grown quieter since the worst of the sickness. Her eyes saw more than she said. She asked questions that surprised Ilsa. Why does this leaf sting only when torn? Why do some mushrooms grow on death, others on life? Questions most adults never thought to ask. Ilsa began to teach more deliberately. She showed her how to test for poison by smell, how to dry herbs upside down in shade, not sun, how to tell the difference between edible and fatal with only touch. Learn with your skin, she said. Your fingers remember what your mind forgets. Interesting fact, many medieval healers relied on multisensory learning. In the absence of written records, knowledge was retained through touch, smell and repetition. Certain plants were identified not by sight alone but by the texture of the stem or the specific snap of a dried stalk. Ilsa kept a grove deeper in the forest where she grew the things the village would not allow her to touch. Datura, nightshade, monkshood, all dangerous, all useful. She built a fence of woven branches, more symbolic than protective. Inside the air was heavy, almost reverent. Here death and healing grew side by side. Lena asked once, "Why keep these?" "Because one day," Ilsa answered, "you might need them." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Not everything she taught was herbal. Some of it was caution, the way to move through brambles without leaving a trace.
the way to know which plants dulled pain and which could kill a man quietly, not because she wanted the girl to become feared, but because knowledge was power, and power was protection, and women in their world had so little of either. There were dark things in the forest too, not spirits but stories. She once found a clearing where someone had left an animal, its throat slit, surrounded by wax stubs, a failed charm, a curse. She didn't know, but she buried the animal, burned the wax, scattered salt and left without turning her back. Not out of superstition but respect. The woods had rules. She obeyed them. She remembered an old saying, "The forest keeps what the village forgets." And it was true. In the trees she found cures for things that had no name. A lichen that calmed fevers better than mint. A resin from cracked bark that closed wounds faster than any poultice. Things the physicians in their stone towers would never touch. Too proud to kneel in the dirt, she made records on bark, bone, parchment stolen from monastery scraps, coded symbols, secret inks, not to hoard knowledge, but to preserve it, because she knew the church burned books like hers, because she knew that once she died, all that was unwritten might be lost. Lena helped her bury a collection of these writings under an oak. They wrapped it in oilskin, placed it inside a clay pot, and sealed it with wax. "If they ever come for us," she told the girl, "this stays." Lena nodded. Her face was still, but her eyes burned with understanding. Interesting fact, women's knowledge of healing was systematically erased in much of Western Europe during the later medieval period. With the rise of male-dominated medical institutions, and the persecution of witches, centuries of folk wisdom, often encoded in oral tradition or handmade manuscripts, was lost or destroyed. Some surviving fragments only resurfaced in rural folklore. Ulsa knew the forest could not save them forever. Sooner or later, another fever would come, or another priest, or another neighbor with a sharpened word. But here, in this green cathedral, she could prepare. She could pass down what mattered. She began teaching Lena more boldly how to make ink from gall, how to read clouds, how to bind wounds with moss when linen was scarce. Never depend on a single cure, she said, and never show them everything. Because part of healing was protection, not just of the body but of the self. At the base of a willow tree, Ulsa buried a pouch of herbs wrapped in linen. "For strength," she said, "not for others, for you." She looked at Lena. "There will be days when no one will thank you, when they will spit on your help, when they will call you names that burn your skin, but you will still go, you will still help, because you will know what they do not." Lena pressed her palm to the ground. That night, Ulsa slept outside, her back to the roots of a great elm. The stars blinked through the canopy like old eyes. She dreamed of roots crawling beneath her skin, of leaves growing from her fingertips, of her voice rising with the wind, carrying not fear, not sorrow but instruction. She was no longer just a healer. She was becoming a forest of memory, and when she was gone, the girl would remain. Not to remember her. Chapter 10: Legacy in a Forgotten Grave. Ulsa always knew she would not die a celebrated woman. There would be no funeral procession, no headstone carved with her name, no village bell rung to mark her passing. She had buried too many to expect mourning. What mattered was never how the healer died, but whether her last poultice worked, whether her hands had shaken, whether she had left anything behind that could be used again. Legacy in her case would not be words on stone. It would be stains on parchment, scratches in bark, whispered recipes remembered by the few who had dared to learn. She felt it coming, the way a storm announces itself, not in thunder but in stillness. Her legs ached longer now, her breath slowed with each winter. Her vision blurred in the evenings, especially when reading labels scrawled in haste. She hadn't bled in years. Her hands had begun to lose strength. Grinding roots took twice as long. She still woke before the sun, but she stayed in bed longer, listening to the birds before rising. Lena had grown into a young woman, steady, observant, faster than Ulsa had ever been. She moved with a confidence Ulsa had never felt in her youth. And more importantly, she questioned everything. Why this herb over that one? Why do you wait 3 days before steeping it? How do you know when it's enough? Ulsa answered every time, because answers were all she had to leave. The villagers, those who still came, began knocking and asking for Lena. "The young one," they'd say. "She fixed my ankle. She stopped the bleeding. She knows what to do." Ulsa stayed inside, listened, smiled faintly, said nothing. She didn't feel she felt relieved. Interesting fact, in most of medieval Europe, healers, especially women, rarely passed on their knowledge formally. illiteracy, danger of persecution, and fear of being labeled a witch discouraged written records. Oral transmission, apprenticeship and ritual were the only safeguards of knowledge. Still, Ilsa wrote when she could. Bits of bark, ink scraped from soot and berry. She tucked notes into tree hollows, under rocks, between the pages of smuggled texts once discarded by a monastery fire. It wasn't pride, it was desperation. She had seen too much knowledge buried in unmarked graves, centuries of cures lost because the woman who held them had no one to tell. She thought often of her own grave. She didn't want one. Graves were for those who needed to be remembered by the living. She wanted to be remembered by the ground, by the earth she had harvested, walked and bled into. When she died, she asked Lena to place her deep in the forest beneath the willow by the stream. No prayers, no mark, just a handful of herbs and a silence strong enough to echo. But before that, there were things to do. She gave Lena the last of her dangerous herbs, the nightshades, the foxglove, the powders measured in pinches and prayers. Not for use, she said, for no. She handed over the carved bone needles, the steel knife dulled from hundreds of cuts, the mortar and pestle she'd used since she was a girl. These are not tools, she said, they are memory. She didn't say goodbye, that wasn't her. The day she couldn't stand was the day she knew. She drank nothing, ate nothing, just lay in her bed watching the rafters of her hut, fingers curled around a dried sage bundle. Lena sat beside her, silent, no tears, just presence. That was what Ilsa had taught her, presence above all. When her breath finally left her, it did so without struggle. No crowds came, no priest, no songs. Lena wrapped her in a linen sheet. No oils, no pomp, just rosemary and moss, tucked beneath her arms. She carried her through the forest alone, dug the hole by hand, lowered her gently into the earth, and then she sat there until the stars came. Interesting fact, folk healers were often buried outside village limits. Fear of spiritual contamination, ecclesiastical law and communal anxiety about unclean deaths contributed to this isolation in death. Yet many believed that these unmarked graves became sources of power, places where healing energy lingered. Lena didn't mark the spot. She planted yarrow nearby. That was enough. Back in the hut she lit a single candle, opened the books, ran her fingers over Ilsa's note, picked up the mortar, felt its weight. She turned her eyes to the window, to the trail that wound through the trees. The knock would come again. Another wound, another birth, another fever. She would answer it, because that's what Ilsa had done, because that's what she was now. And far below the soil, beneath root and stone and centuries of silence, the forest remembered. But to replace her, it took time for the village to notice that Ilsa was gone. At first, people assumed she was ill again, perhaps resting. Then, when Lena answered the door alone for a third day in a row, some grew curious. She's not well, the girl said to those who asked. She needs quiet. It wasn't a lie, it just belonged to a moment already past. A few suspected what had truly happened. The tanner's wife, once saved by Ilsa's fever tea, left bread and salt at the edge of the forest. A shepherd lit a candle in his window for 7 nights. No words were spoken, but the gestures were enough. Those who understood grief didn't need to speak it. The priest made no mention. There was no sermon for the healer, no prayers offered. She had not been buried on church grounds. She had not confessed her sins. She had not, in his eyes, been redeemed. But Lena didn't need his approval. Ilsa had taught her the quiet defiance of survival. And now, it was Lena who stood at the hearth, who stirred the teas and crushed the bark, who spoke gently to women in labor and washed the wounds of those too afraid to go to town. The healer's work never stopped. It only changed hands. Lena found that the hardest part wasn't the medicine. It was the weight of memory. Every herb on the shelf carried a voice. Every notch in the table was a lesson. Every drawer held a ghost. She would reach for comfrey and remember the man with the shattered ankle, who wept when he walked again. She would pour wine over wounds, and see Ilsa's face, focused and silent. The dead left echoes, especially those who healed the living. Still, she worked. A boy with rashes, a woman with milk fever, a man with tremors in his hands. They came as they always had, quietly, cautiously, never too eager to be seen, but desperate enough to knock. And now it was Lena who opened the door, who said, "Come in," and meant it. She didn't try to replace Ilsa. She didn't imitate her voice or mimic her movements, but she remembered, and that was enough. She brewed the same teas, tied herbs in the same bundles, used the same knife, worn, dull but true. She taught no one yet, but she knew she would. In time, someone would appear. They always did. She kept Ilsa's old pouch in a drawer. The one with the vial, the one meant for mercy, not medicine. She never opened it, but she didn't throw it away. There were parts of healing she hoped never to need. But she knew too well that hope was no protection, only preparation. Interesting fact, in some rural parts of Europe, healing traditions passed down through women across multiple generations, but often only to one successor at a time. The secrecy wasn't just tradition, it was protection. Too much knowledge spread too widely could invite suspicion, envy, or accusations of sorcery. Healers often chose one pupil carefully, and transferred their wisdom quietly over years. Seasons turned. The grove Ilsa planted began to bloom again. Chamomile spread wild in the clearing. Borage rose with blue petals in midsummer. The yarrow she had planted near her grave came in thick, resilient, unbothered by frost. Lena didn't touch those, not yet. She noticed that the village spoke of Ilsa differently now, not warmly, exactly, but not with fear either. There was a reverence in the silence. She had become a fact of the land, like the stream or the crag in the northern field. Someone said, "The old healer, she did good," and no one corrected him. That was more than she ever got in life. They would not remember her face, but they would remember the way the fevers cooled. The baby stopped crying. The wounds closed. That was all Ilsa had ever wanted. Lena spent one evening writing, not a full book, just a page, a list of herbs, a drawing of a wound, a short paragraph about the way hawthorn bark must be dried in moonlight, never sun. She folded the page, tucked it into a wooden box, and buried it near the willow tree, not for herself, not yet, but for whoever might come next, because there would always be someone, another girl, another illness, another need, and when that girl came knocking, Lena would be there, not to be the next Ilsa, but to carry what she left behind. In time, Lena would forget the sound of the healer's voice, but she would never forget the weight of her mortal, the feel of the forest beneath her feet, the silence of a life built on saving others without asking for thanks. And in that silence the healer would live on, not in stone, not in scripture, but in the hands of the one who followed her. And so we close the worn, quiet pages of our journey, through smoky huts, forest shadows and fevered rooms. We followed the path of a medieval healer, not a saint, not a sorceress, but a woman with calloused hands, sharp memory, and quiet defiance. She lived unnamed in history, buried beyond consecrated ground, but her work stitched into wounds, steeped in teas, whispered between trees, lives on, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, an invisible thread in the fabric of survival. As the world around her changed through plague, persecution and prayer, she remained, silent, steady, unseen, a keeper of life in a world that did not know how to thank her. Let her memory drift with you into sleep. And if you ever walk alone in the woods, and the air smells faintly of mint and moss, listen closely, the forest remembers. Good night. You've been listening to The Drowsy Historian. Rest well, the past will keep.